The cellar was colder than Edmund Thorne remembered. Moist air clung to the stone walls, carrying the smell of earth and metal from the lantern's wick. His breath came out in a mist that drifted toward the glass plate propped in the camera frame. The tripod stood perfectly still. He had tested the balance twice. On the crate before him sat the pumpkin, a flawless specimen, round and firm, its rind smooth as polished copper beneath the thin light. He adjusted the lantern flame, careful not to disturb the exposure. 4 minutes, that was all it would take. 4 minutes of stillness, of air thick with silence, to fix a simple gourd into history. He lowered the lens cap and whispered, "Hold steady now." It was a habit from portrait work, the way he used to speak to sitters as they froze in awkward poses. The pumpkin did not answer, of course. Only the faint crackle of the wick replied, joined by the slow drip of condensation from the ceiling. Edmund's eyes moved between the timing watch in his palm and the shadow pooling behind the crate. He felt the weight of solitude pressing around him. No sound from the upper floors, no footsteps from the corridor. He was alone, as he had requested, to ensure that nothing disturbed the collodion exposure. The first minute passed easily. The second drew slower. In the wavering lantern light, the pumpkin's surface seemed to catch a faint luster, as though its skin had grown damp. He frowned but did not move. His teacher's voice echoed in memory. Never doubt the stillness. The light records what you cannot see. Still, something about the reflection unsettled him. The shine looked almost like the glisten of a lip. He blinked hard. When he opened his eyes, the illusion was gone. Just shadow, he told himself. Nothing more than a play of moisture and glass. He adjusted his stance, flexing the stiffness from his legs. The cellar hummed faintly with the low song of pipes above. 3 minutes. He began to count softly under his breath, the way he did with human subjects. 1, 2, 3. Steady, steady. His words fell flat against the stone. The silence thickened again, heavy and expectant. For a fleeting instant he thought he heard something, an exhalation, almost human, passing from the direction of the crate. His hand froze on the watch chain. The hair at the back of his neck prickled, but when he turned the lantern slightly, the pumpkin stared back, innocent and still. "Draft," he muttered, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just a draft through the vent." At last, the seconds ended. He replaced the lens cap and exhaled sharply, the tension easing from his shoulders. The exposure was finished. Another specimen captured, one of dozens he had taken that week for Dr. Bray's yield study. He packed the camera carefully, then lifted the plate holder with both hands, moving it toward the small darkroom at the far end of the cellar. His boots scraped against the stone floor, the echo following him like a whisper of repetition. Inside the darkroom, only the dim ruby lamp glowed. He set the plate onto the table, pouring the developer across its surface. The silver nitrate shimmered as the image emerged, first faint outlines, then the crate, then the round bulk of the pumpkin. His pulse steadied as the photograph came to life, ordinary and precise, exactly as he expected. The lantern light had caught the edges beautifully. He nodded to himself, relieved. Yet, when he leaned closer, something inside him hesitated. For the briefest moment, no longer than a breath, the shape at the center seemed to alter, as though a shadow deepened along its curve. It was gone before he could be sure. Edmund stared until his eyes watered, then wiped his sleeve across the glass. The surface cleared. Nothing wrong. Nothing strange. He laughed quietly under his breath, though it sounded hollow. "You've been at this too long," he whispered to his reflection in the glass. The image gazed back, dull and still. By morning, the print was dry. He delivered it to Dr. Bray's office, left it on the desk, and returned to his duties without mention. Yet the feeling of unease clung to him like residue. Each time he passed the cellar door, he found himself glancing at it longer than necessary. He told himself it was exhaustion. The long hours, the chemical fumes, the loneliness that came from working beneath ground. But when dusk fell and the gas lamps flickered against the window panes, the image of that faint, impossible gleam would return to him. That night, Edmund sat in his rented room on Crow Street, staring at the photograph's duplicate he had made for his own records. The pumpkin seemed too perfect, too still, its shadow pooling oddly beneath it. "A trick of light," he whispered. But even as he said it, he felt certain he had seen something more, a suggestion, a curvature, like the ghost of expression held in suspension. He set the photograph face down on his desk and turned away. Outside, wind scraped across the shutters, and from the street below came the laughter of children. Early for All Hallows' Eve, he thought. One of them carried a candle. Its glow flickered against his ceiling, and he could almost imagine it shining from within the gourd itself, the way a lantern's smile would. He slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with dim rooms and faces half-formed in shadow. When dawn broke, he convinced himself the feeling would fade. Work, he reasoned, would clear his mind. But deep in the cellar, where the walls still held the echo of his voice and the crate stood faintly marked with residue, a photograph hung drying on its line, its image locked forever in silver and light. And there, just at the edge of visibility, something in the pumpkin's contour shifted again, almost imperceptibly. A curve, a suggestion, the faintest trace of lips drawn upward. It would be years before anyone else noticed it, years before the photograph was magnified and studied, and the truth of that exposure questioned. For now, the world remained ignorant. Only the plate knew. Only the image kept the secret. What you're about to hear is the accumulation of evidence that the smile was not carved into the gourd after the photograph, but appeared only in the photograph itself, while the physical pumpkin remained blank. This is the case of the jack-o'-lantern that smiled before it was carved. The cellar was colder than usual that October afternoon, the kind of chill that crept into the fingers and stayed there, dulling every movement. Edmund Thorne steadied the heavy brass lens of the camera with both hands, his breath visible in the dim light that filtered through the iron-grated window. Water dripped steadily from a pipe above, the sound echoing like a slow metronome between the stone walls. The pumpkin sat motionless on a crate a few feet away, round, unblemished, and ordinary. Yet, to Thorne's strained eyes, there was something unsettling about the way it caught the light, as if the shadows clung to it more stubbornly than they should have. He adjusted the tripod one last time, struck the match to ignite the gas lamp behind him, and muttered, "Hold steady, old thing," though the subject could not hear him. He was alone, save for the faint hum of the lamp and the hollow groan of the cellar's wooden beams. In the days since he had begun photographing the Institute's harvest specimens, he had found a strange calm in the stillness these sessions demanded. But today, his mind was not calm. It lingered on the uneasy laughter of the men upstairs who spoke of All Hallows' Eve and the spirits that walk before the frost. The exposure began. 4 minutes. He stood back and watched the motionless gourd through the rising fumes of collodion vapors, his heart keeping pace with the ticking of his pocket watch. The pumpkin's surface glowed faintly under the lamplight. Too warm, too alive. By the time the exposure ended, his head throbbed with chemical scent. He wiped his hands on his apron and looked once more at the object on the crate. For a moment, he thought he saw a curve on its surface, an illusion of shadow perhaps, like the half-smile of a face glimpsed in fog. He blinked, and it was gone. That night, Edmund carried the wet plate upstairs to develop it. The Institute's laboratory smelled of sulfur and vinegar. The floor was littered with discarded negatives. He poured the developer over the plate with practiced precision, rocking it gently to spread the liquid. The image emerged slowly, silver blooming into form, the crate, the gourd, the soft gradient of shadow behind. Everything appeared ordinary. He breathed out a long sigh of relief and hung it to dry beside the other prints. "Another day's work done," he murmured, rubbing his eyes. But something in him remained restless, as though the photograph itself was not finished looking back at him. 2 days later, Dr. Cornelius Bray found him in the hallway, pale and distracted, his hands still stained with silver nitrate. "Thorne, you look ghastly. What is it now?" the director asked, his tone both concerned and impatient. "The print," Edmund said quietly. "The pumpkin in frame 47. It looks different now." Bray frowned. "Different? You mean spoiled?" The chemical batch might have been uneven. "No," Edmund replied, his voice trembling just slightly. "It looks as though it's grinning." Bray stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "You're overworked. Take a few days' rest and stop staring at those plates for so long. The mind plays tricks when one hasn't seen the sun." He clapped Thorne's shoulder and moved on, muttering something about nerves and nonsense. That evening, Edmund sat alone in the cellar once again. The place had grown quieter since the other assistants retired for the night. He brought a lamp close to the drying print, tilting it under the glow. The pumpkin stared back, unchanged, yet somehow not the same. The play of shadow formed a faint curvature on its side, a darkness shaped like lips parted in faint amusement. His breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered, pressing his thumb against the glass. "It can't be." In the days that followed, he avoided speaking of it again. He worked mechanically, photographing carrots, beets, and potatoes, each captured with flawless accuracy. Yet whenever he passed the envelope labeled "atmospheric interference" in the archive cabinet, a shiver went through him. The handwriting on the label, his own, seemed almost foreign now, as though written by someone else entirely. 9 years later, in 1891, the photograph resurfaced in the hands of Lydia Graham, a conservator tasked with digitizing the Harwell Institute's archives. She was a precise woman, known for her steady work and sharp mind. But when she lifted the print from its envelope, the room seemed to cool. The smile, if one could call it that, was faint but unmistakable. It was no trick of light. It was structure, shadow, and form arranged with deliberate geometry. She measured it twice, then a third time. The curve was 2.3 inches wide, the teeth, tiny crescents of lighter tone, numbered 12 in total. She checked the logbook. The specimen was recorded as solid, uncut, intact. Later that evening, she met with the Society's president, Mr. Allen Mershaw, in his dim office lined with oil portraits and filing drawers. "Humidity, perhaps," he said after her explanation, waving a dismissive hand. "Old emulsions play tricks on the eye." Lydia shook her head. "Then why do the other photographs from the same session, the carrots, the beets, show no aberration?" The chemistry was consistent. The exposure times identical, Mershaw sighed. "You're chasing ghosts, Miss Graham." "I suggest you record it as an emulsion defect and move on." When she left the office, she paused at the bottom of the stairwell, her hand on the iron railing. For a fleeting moment, she thought she heard the faint sound of laughter drifting from the archive room below, not loud, but soft and hollow, as if muffled through glass. She froze, listening. The building was empty. Only the wind brushed against the high windows, yet the sound seemed to follow her as she left. The official record would later describe the anomaly as an atmospheric interference due to moisture and temperature fluctuation. But Lydia knew what she saw. The curvature was too human, the precision too deliberate. It was not the mark of accident, nor the whim of chemistry. She wrote in her memorandum, "A crescent aperture 2.3 inches wide, exhibiting dentition inconsistent with vegetable morphology, positioned where shadow topology suggests a hollow interior, yet the specimen log confirms the gourd was solid upon harvest." The explanation was filed and forgotten. The case dismissed. But 3 other photographs taken in the same session, of carrots and beets, showed no such aberration. The air in cellar 3 was colder than usual that afternoon, the kind of chill that made even breath sound brittle. Edmund Thorne stepped carefully down the stone steps, one hand gripping the iron railing, the other steadying a wooden crate against his chest. Inside it rested a single pumpkin, perfectly round, its surface unblemished except for a faint patch of darker hue near the stem. He set the crate onto the flagged floor, the echo of wood against stone lingering for a heartbeat too long. The cellar smelled of damp limestone, oil lamps, and earth, an aroma Thorne had come to associate with silence. Only the faint hiss of the lantern and the tick of his pocket watch broke the stillness. He rubbed his chilled fingers together before laying out the equipment: camera tripod, glass plate holder, and the bottles of collodion and silver nitrate. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. He had performed this process countless times, yet today there was a tremor in his hand, as though something in the air resisted the stillness he depended upon. He positioned the pumpkin on the crate beneath a single hanging lamp. Its round shape caught the faint golden glow, casting a soft, oval shadow on the stone wall. "Stay still," Thorne murmured absently, a habit he had formed from years of instructing human subjects to hold their pose. The absurdity of speaking to a vegetable drew a faint smile from him, though it faded as quickly as it came. He adjusted the focus and peered through the ground glass, noting how perfectly the form filled the frame. The reflection of light across the smooth rind seemed almost expectant. When he removed the lens cap, time seemed to thicken. For 4 minutes and 10 seconds, nothing stirred. The slow seep of chemicals on the plate, the patient patience of exposure, every second stretched, as though the cellar itself held its breath. Thorne could feel the pulse in his fingertips, the faint pressure of the world narrowing to this single moment. A man, a camera, and a pumpkin. When it was done, he exhaled and covered the lens. 4 minutes, 10, he noted aloud, writing the figures in his logbook. He cleaned his hands and carried the plate carefully to the darkroom, aware of the faint tremor in his reflection as it shimmered on the surface of the developing bath. The faint image began to form, grainy at first, then sharp. The pumpkin sat silent in the frame, just as it had in the cellar, plain, expressionless, ordinary. He exhaled in relief. By morning, the photograph was dry and crisp, fixed to the world. Thorne delivered it to Dr. Bray's office with the rest of the week's images, beets, carrots, barley samples, all neatly labeled. The director barely looked up from his desk when Thorne laid the photograph among the pile. "Very good, Thorne. Continue with the soil samples next week," Bray murmured, and that was that. For 2 days the matter rested quietly, but the night of October 31st would unsettle that calm forever. Thorne sat alone in his rented room on Crow Street, the faint sounds of revelry echoing outside, the distant laughter of boys carrying lanterns, the toll of the church bell marking the last hour before midnight. On his small table lay the photograph, still in its envelope. He had taken it home almost without realizing why. Perhaps it was pride in the clarity of the exposure, or curiosity. He told himself it was professional diligence. Yet as he stared at the sealed envelope, he felt a faint unease, as though something waited behind the paper. He unfolded it and laid the print flat beneath the lamplight. The image was the same as before, at least at first. But as the minutes passed, he began to feel something shift in the light. The pumpkin's surface seemed darker on one side, a faint curvature emerging, subtle, like the impression of a mouth not yet smiling but about to. He blinked hard. When his eyes adjusted again, the shadow was gone. He poured himself water, convinced fatigue was playing tricks. Still, he slept poorly that night. The image burned into the backs of his eyelids. The next morning, November 1st, Thorne arrived at the Institute before dawn. He requested to see the photograph again. Martin Good, a fellow assistant, handed it to him with a puzzled look. "You developing new methods, Thorne?" he teased, noticing his colleague's pallor. Thorne held the photograph close to the lamp. His breath caught. "It's changed," he whispered. Good frowned. "Changed?" "It's a photograph. man." Thorne turned the print toward him. "It wasn't smiling yesterday. I would have seen it." Good squinted, leaning in. Under the warm lamplight, the image indeed bore a subtle difference. The curvature that had once been a faint shadow now formed something unmistakable. A crescent on the pumpkin side, just shallow enough to suggest lips. Good chuckled uneasily. "A trick of the eye, that's all. It's All Hallows Night. Spirits are high." But Thorne didn't laugh. He set the photograph down, staring at it as though expecting the shape to move again. His hand trembled slightly when he tucked it back into the envelope. "It wasn't there," he muttered. "I'd have seen it." By evening, word had spread among the assistants that Thorne had frightened himself with one of his own prints. Dr. Bray dismissed it as fatigue. Yet Thorne's logbook entries for that week grew increasingly erratic, skipped dates, uneven handwriting, phrases scratched out as if censored by a trembling conscience. Years later, when Lydia Graham examined the same photograph in 1891 under a jeweler's loupe, she noticed what no one before her had dared to record. Around the faint mouth, the texture of the rind seemed altered. Minute radial lines, not cracks, but the delicate striations one might see around a human lip pulled into a smile. She measured them, sketched them, then stopped abruptly when she realized they followed biological rather than botanical geometry. Her letter to Professor Alistair Hitch was both polite and desperate. "The aperture appears deliberate," she wrote, "yet no incision is visible. The topology suggests muscle fiber rather than vegetable tissue." Weeks later, Hitch's reply arrived, its tone half curious, half alarmed. "The image exhibits no manual alteration, yet the feature you describe is optically impossible unless the light source was internal to the specimen, a condition I cannot reconcile with known photochemistry." The words "internal light source" haunted her for the rest of her career. The pumpkin itself, long discarded, had decomposed normally, leaving no evidence of tampering. But Thorne's behavior in those final days would become the true evidence of something far stranger. In 1947, when a hymnal was repaired at St. Brendan's Church in Arkham, 3 brittle pages were found pressed between its bindings. They bore Thorne's handwriting, shaky but legible, dated November 3, 1882. "I have burned the negative, but the smile remains in my copy. It is wider now." No negative was ever found. On the morning of November 24, 1882, the stone corridors of the Harwell Agricultural Institute were cold enough to make every footstep echo like a strike of glass. The faint hiss of gas lamps flickered along the cellar stairs as Dr. Emmett Lowell descended, following the constable's lantern beam. At the bottom, the air was thick with the damp, root-like smell of decay. And there, beside an empty wooden crate, knelt Edmund Thorne. He was motionless, one hand braced on the ground, the other clutching a kitchen knife. His breath came shallow, his gaze fixed on the crate's interior as though something invisible still occupied it. The constable whispered, "He hasn't moved since we found him." Dr. Lowell nodded silently, then approached with the careful patience of a man stepping through a dream. The crate was empty, only stains of moisture along the bottom board, the faint rot of pumpkin flesh long gone. The floorboards around Thorne were scratched as though he had dragged something heavy in circles. When Lowell crouched beside him, Thorne finally spoke, his voice brittle but steady. It was smiling again. Wider this time. I thought, if I carved it myself, it might stop. The physician studied his face, pale, streaked with soot and exhaustion, eyes red as though he had not slept for days. "There's nothing here, Mr. Thorne," he said softly. "The specimen is gone." Thorne's expression did not change. He kept staring into the crate, whispering, "Then where did it go?" Lowell noted everything in his ledger later that day. Thorne's pulse erratic, his speech coherent yet colored by fixation. He reported lucidity with hallucination, a condition he could neither name nor treat. Thorne was escorted upstairs, protesting only once when an attendant brushed against the envelope containing his photograph. "Don't touch that," he said sharply, clutching it to his chest. "It remembers who looks." For 3 nights, Thorne remained in his lodging under supervision. He refused to face mirrors, covered the windows with sheets, and would only eat when the room was dimly lit. His landlady, Mrs. Prudence Blackwell, later told Dr. Lowell that he had wrapped every reflective surface in cheesecloth and muttered to himself about the watching light. When she entered his room to clean, she found a half-burned photograph in the grate and another laid carefully beneath his pillow, wrapped in linen. She said he guarded it like a relic or a warning. The investigation at the Institute deepened in his absence. Dr. Cornelius Bray wrote to Dr. Oswald Finch at Wrightson College, enclosing a careful sketch of the pumpkin's grin. His letter, stamped November 8th, was both clinical and anxious. Is there any natural condition by which vegetable tissue might, under unknown factors, imitate the dental structure of a child? When Finch's reply arrived a week later, Bray read it twice before folding it into his ledger. The words chilled him. 12 visible incisors, 4 mm canine spacing, human geometry. No gourd could display such, Finch wrote, not by shadow nor by trick of light, unless hollowed and lit from within. But the harvest log stated plainly, the specimen had been weighed whole, 11 pounds, unpierced, uncut. Bray summoned his staff that evening. The cellar doors were unsealed, the photographic trays inspected, and every remaining negative reviewed. None showed aberration, only frame number 47 bore the smiling gourd. Still, Bray was not a man to confess fear. He stored the photograph in a drawer marked atmospheric, locked it, and told his assistants to forget the matter. But in private, he sent one more letter to Professor Alistair Hitch of Bromwell Technical College, a man whose interests wandered between optics and the occult. He requested an independent examination of the print. By the winter of 1891, Hitch had arrived in Thornbury with his instruments. He worked in the Institute's basement for 2 nights, performing what he called a backward spectrographic assay. When he emerged, his face was gray, his voice slow and deliberate. "The smile," he told Bray's successor, "is in the emulsion's final layer, the one that should have been exposed last." Which means, he hesitated, glancing toward the sealed envelope, the image was impressed backward through time. He published nothing of his findings. No journal would take the paper. It was dismissed as madness. But in his private notebook, later recovered by his son, Hitch wrote one more line. If the light came from within the subject, it did not behave as light, but as memory. Meanwhile, Thorne's dismissal was quietly arranged. Officially, it was due to nervous exhaustion. Unofficially, his superiors feared his story might tarnish the Institute's reputation. He packed his few belongings, his camera, a satchel of notebooks, and the surviving photograph, and left Thornbury without farewell. His last verifiable act was recorded on January 2, 1883, at the Arkham Post Office. A small parcel mailed to E. Thorne, General Delivery, Dunwich. No record of its contents exists. Years later, the photograph would resurface. The Thornbury Antiquarian Society catalogued it in 1923, enclosed in an envelope marked supernumerary. By then, 2 archivists had already resigned after claiming the image's smile shifted when the room was dark. The final curator who handled it wrote a single annotation in the log before sealing it away for good. Observed subtle motion within the mouth's shadow. Appears to follow viewer's position. The envelope was stamped, waxed, and placed into storage under strict restriction. It has remained there ever since, unopened, unseen by public eyes. It has not been publicly displayed since. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of the supernatural, the unexplained, and the eerie overlap between art and the unknown. Its purpose is to evoke curiosity, spark imagination, and inspire reflection on the chilling mysteries that defy logic and linger in forgotten photographs.